right, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Berry Lecture in Public Philosophy. Um, my name is Matthew Congdon. I'm an assistant professor here in the philosophy department at Vanderbilt University. Before we get started, I just have a couple announcements more on the logistical side of things. So tonight's lecture and the question and answer period afterwards are being recorded and will be posted to the Vanderbilt Philosophy YouTube channel. So if you have a friend or a colleague who was not able to watch this lecture live tonight, you can tell them. You can visit youtube.com, enter Vanderbilt University Philosophy Department in the search, and there you'll find a recording of this event and actually a number of other lectures and discussions hosted by Vanderbilt Philosophy. Tonight's lecture is going to be approximately 40 minutes, followed by a 5-minute break. And then we will open the floor to discussion for the time that we have remaining. At the bottom of your screen in the Zoom application, you should find a Q&A button. To ask a question when we get to the Q&A after the lecture, just click that button. You'll see it'll give you a field to fully type out your question. And the moderator, which is me, will read your question aloud for our speaker to answer. We ask that you use the Q&A function to type your question rather than the chat or the hand raise function, as this is going to allow us to get through as many of your questions as possible in the time that we have. Finally, I just want to say a very quick thank you to a number of folks who did a lot of great organizational work behind the scenes to make this event possible. I'm just going to publicly acknowledge a few individuals: Emma Costa, Kelly Cunningham, Liz Fiss, Lou Outlaw, Rob Talise, Paul Taylor, and Dion Worthy. Thank you so much for your organizational efforts. So that does it for my announcements, which means we can get on to the main event. So it is my great pleasure to give the floor to W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Philosophy Department, Professor Paul C. Taylor.
Thank you, Professor Congdon. I want to add some words of thanks to the ones that Professor Congdon has already given us. In particular, I'm keen to thank Professor Congdon, who is the chair of our programming committee. He has mobilized the forces that he just named to pull off this event and many others in our programming calendar for the year. This would not be possible without his incredible work, and we're incredibly grateful to you, Matt, for everything you've done. Also grateful to the other folks you've named. I will not name them again. I want to add to that, though, that we need to thank John Geer, Dean of the College of Arts and Science, for supporting this initiative. And we need to thank Alan Berry, who is the benefactor who has provided the resources to make this event and the series of which this is a part possible. The annual Berry Lectures began in 1988. They were funded initially by John and Shirley Locke and by Alan Berry and his father, Kendall Berry. And it's through their generous support that we've been able to do this every year. And we change the program a little bit from time to time, but usually the focus is on bringing a nationally known or internationally known thinker to Nashville to think with us about one of the deep and abiding moral problems that confront us in this experiment in social interaction and social cooperation. And it is in that spirit that we have invited Professor Glaude to come here and join us. And to introduce him, we have Professor Outlaw, about whom I should say a few words. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge that I've had the privilege of knowing Professor Glaude for more years than either of us probably care to admit. If I were to introduce him, I would go on for longer than any of us want me to go on. So I'm glad to be able to hand it over to Professor Outlaw to do those honors. I should say a few words about him as I do that. Lucius Outlaw is the Joseph A. Johnson Jr. Distinguished Leadership Professor and the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy here in our department. He is a former Associate Provost of Undergraduate Education here at Vanderbilt. He is a proud graduate of Fisk University and of W.C. Henderson High School in Starkville, Mississippi. He formerly held the T. Wistar Brown Chair in Philosophy at Haverford College, where he hosted a number of rollicking reading group meetings at which Professor Glaude cut his scholarly teeth many, many years ago. And so with those words, I want to thank Professor Outlaw for stepping in here and introducing Professor Glaude, and I will turn the floor over to him.
Thank you, Paul. It is intellectually stimulating always to be in Eddie's presence and to partake of what Eddie has to say. But please allow me the personal privilege of speaking about how deeply rewarding this is personally as well. As Paul has mentioned, Eddie, I came to know Eddie early on during his graduate career. We met when he accompanied a prominent professor, sociologist Howard Wynett, to my home to discuss whether it was feasible to form a reading group of people from greater Philadelphia, Princeton area colleges and universities to come together regularly to explore what is this, what we call mother of all concepts called race. And it was a graduate student at the time, was in that group. We formed that group with people from Haverford College, Princeton, Temple, a local foundation, a woman who had been a graduate student at Fisk. When meeting at Princeton once, we had the wonderful, wonderful experience of being able to go to the home to sit with a person who wanted to meet and get to know a few of us who were wrestling with this wonderful concept of race, and said, yeah, why don't you bring them by the house? And that person was none other than Toni Morrison. So it was a wonderful experience across nearly 4 years. And it's been interesting to see what writings have come out of that group who have gone on to write about race. So it was in that context that I came to know and appreciate Eddie, and he honored me later by visiting my home with his wife and son. And later through our relationship, referred to me in the most honorific way by calling me at one point, Pops. That was not a trivial word coming from Eddie. So I am deeply honored and proud to be able to introduce Eddie as a son of Mississippi who has called me Pops, and to know how much that means to me. Eddie is the James McDowell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, a program he first became involved with shaping as a doctoral candidate religion at Princeton. He is a former president of the American Academy of Religion. He has published books on religion and philosophy, including An Uncommon Faith, a pragmatic approach to the study of African American religion. African American religion is a very short introduction. And Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in early 19th century Black America. He has also written about democracy in Black, how race still enslaves the American soul, and then A Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, which takes a wide look at Black communities, the difficulties of race in the United States, and the challenges of that our democracy face. Eddie is known to be a convener of conversations and debate, and takes great care to engage fellow citizens of all ages and backgrounds, from young activists to fellow academics to journalists and commentators and followers on Twitter, to engage them in dialogue about the direction of the nation. His scholarship and his sense of himself as a public intellectual are driven by a very deep, and I might even say sacred, commitment to think carefully with others in public. Eddie's most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, was published in June of last year. Of Baldwin, Eddie writes, Baldwin's writing does not bear witness to the glory of America. It reveals the country's sins and the illusions of innocence that blinds us to the reality of others. Baldwin's vision requires a confrontation with our history, with slavery, Jim Crow segregation, with whiteness, to overcome its hold on us, not to posit the greatness of America, but to establish the ground on which to imagine the country anew. In some ways, I believe that it has been Eddie's encounter, his engagement with Baldwin, to borrow from Nahum Chandler, his inhabitation of the writings and thinking of Baldwin in ways that he's come into his own Baldwin-esque kind of fuller being as a public intellectual and a thinker. It is a really profound pleasure to have Eddie share his thinking with us on the occasion of this very lecture. And again, a personal triumph to bear witness to him decades after those years together as he was working his way up to becoming this profound thinker and public intellectual. And my homeboy from Mississippi. Eddie, welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Pops, for that, that gracious introduction. You know, you've been an inspiration and a model for me since my early days at Morehouse College, even though I didn't take your class at Spelman. I can recall as well with a bit of awe the way you dissected arguments and argued for your positions, especially with Paul Jefferson in the reading group, in our racial theory reading group when I was a graduate student. And I just want to let everyone know that I've cherished your professional and personal advice. You've told me to lay in the cut so many times and to work on my craft over these years. So I just want to thank you for being a role model. Thank you to Ms. Frida and your family for being so open to us. Thank you for everything that you've done for the profession. I want to also thank Brother Congdon for all of the work that he's done to help this event come to fruition. My schedule is a bit like herding cats. So this is a great achievement. So thank you, Professor Congdon. I want to thank Professor Talise as well, and all the others that were mentioned for making this event possible. I'm especially grateful to my dearest friend of over 35 years, Professor Paul C. Taylor. We have seen and experienced so much together, from our pre-freshman experience in the summer science program in 1985. And I should note that I could neither add or subtract then or now. But from that moment during the summer science program to the birth of our children, it's been a wonderful journey. Professor Taylor, you have blessed me with your brilliance, with your humor, and your overall commitment to the good over these so many years. I'm blessed to call you my friend, that we've walked this journey together for so long, and here we are now. I have so many friends generally at Vanderbilt, and I'm thankful for each of you, too many to name, but Dean Towns and Professor Victor Anderson and Dyson and so many others. So I just want to thank you all for your presence. I began to talk, so let me begin to talk. I want to begin with two epigraphs and then I'll jump into this. Bear with me in terms of the form. I'm trying to work something out here. But the two epigraphs come from Baldwin and Stanley Cavell. So the first, the time has come to realize that the interracial drama acted out on the American continent has not only created a new Black man, it has created a new white man too. No road whatever will lead Americans back to the simplicity of this European village, where white men still have the luxury of looking on me as a stranger. Baldwin, Stranger in the Village. The second quotation is from Cavell, as I mentioned. The democratic need for perfection is a path from the idea of there being one, call him Socrates, who represents for each of us the height of the journey, to the idea of each of us being representative for each of us, an idea that is a threat as much as an opportunity. Now, I've set myself a somewhat difficult task this evening. I want to say a bit about what I'm calling James Baldwin's Black democratic perfectionism, and the adjectives matter here. And I recognize that I don't have the space or time or energy for that matter. I'm an early riser and it's getting late here on the East Coast to make good on all of my claims. You know, and Baldwin left us over 7,000 pages of work, and any careful explication of his view would require much more of me than what I'm prepared to offer this evening. What I hope to do instead is convince you by way of readings of particular passages from his nonfiction writings and some other enchantments of the value of describing Baldwin as a Black democratic perfectionist and of the political implications of this view beyond anything Baldwin might have said or written. Now, what will hopefully come into view is the different way in which I read perfectionism. Actually, not so much a different way, just my different placement of the accents. Of course, the motivations here, and it is one I understand as consonant with Baldwin's, is to take seriously the condition of those quote unquote improbable aristocrats who dare to reach for a higher self in a world that devalues and generally disregards them, and to gesture at the political implications of such an act. Here, the shift in accent and in subject, I believe, changes the ground of the Emersonian project. Well, maybe not so much the ground, but that sounds grand, it seems to me. Perfectionism, at least in the hands of Baldwin, and in my hands too, I suppose, sings the blues and samples from a Black archive. I think we have much to learn here. Now, as with much of my work, I find myself in conversation with my dear friend, Professor Paul C. Taylor, especially in this case, his important essay on Dr. King and moral perfectionism in To Shape a New World, essays on the political philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., edited by Tommy Shelby and Brandon Terry. Now, one feature of Professor Taylor's account of King and moral perfectionism involves one feature he isolates is self-criticism, what he describes as that, quote, interrogation of the self, perhaps to the point of self-loathing, as part of the work of ethical criticism and social criticism, end quote. I think this feature will draw my attention in this talk because it has drawn my attention elsewhere. I've been stumbling around perfectionism for almost a decade now. Can you imagine? I've been writing for more than that, right? That's interesting. But I've been stumbling around perfectionism for almost a decade now. If I wasn't so anxious about influence, Harold Bloom to be damned, I would hearken back to my graduate school days with Jeffrey Stout and Cornel West and our reading of Stanley Cavell, but I will not. But in my Harvard Du Bois lectures in 2011, I insisted that we read Miss Ella Baker as what I called then a situated perfectionist, namely that the very reach for a higher self on her view entailed a struggle not simply with the dangers of conformity, but with the conditions that block the way to our understanding of who we can be and who we are capable and what we are capable of. For her, the primacy of human will and practice remain, but are shadowed by the persistence of evils that often frustrate our self-realization. That different accent I mentioned above, right? The task, on my reading of Ms. Baker, is to develop one's unique talents within the community and to understand those talents as gifts capable of transforming the circumstances of one's living. But the ground of that work, I argued then, is fraught, vexed precisely because of the practices that deepen self-doubt, even self-hatred. Now, I'll have a little bit more to say about this a bit later. I also tried to say something about this general orientation a little bit in a small book entitled An Uncommon Faith. And there I offered a reading of W. Du Bois's Of the Passing of the Firstborn, and put forward something I called then a reconstructed perfectionism. I suppose the different names indicate that I was, and in some ways remain, unclear about what I'm trying to say, but I wanted to foreground the reality of woundedness and brokenness as the ground for the Black perfectionist impulse. When Black people aspire for a higher self or something more, it all too often stems from the irrepressible and irrevocable fact of brokenness, the wounds of white supremacy, the effects of double consciousness, as it were. As Du Bois wrote in Souls of Black Folk, quote, "The bowed and bent old man cries with thrice repeated wail, 'O Lord, keep me from sinking down,' and he rebukes the devil of doubt who can whisper, 'Jesus is dead and God's gone away.' Yet the soul hunger is there, the restlessness of the savage, the well of the wanderer, and the pliant is put in one little phrase, 'My soul wants something that's new,' end quote. Here one refuses to view wound and brokenness as a permanent fixed state and aspires instead to something more, where a relentless faith in the possible, I argued, without metaphysical guarantee, evidences itself in radical dispositions toward the world as it is, towards those who would do anything to keep it that way, and in the service of the world as it could be. This requires, I argued, self-love and self-trust of the sort outlined in Morrison's love poem in Beloved. Quote, here, in this place, we flesh, flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh, they despise it, end quote. Now, my recent work on James Baldwin has brought these two exercises together to think about Black democratic perfectionism as the radical cultivation of democratic individuality in the service of racial justice. Baldwin's nonfiction writing in particular offers a wonderful example of what I mean by the phrase. In these pages, he grabs Ralph Waldo Emerson by the collar and drags him across the proverbial tracks, where the quest, if that's the right word, for a higher self takes place under conditions of captivity and precarity, and I should add, joy. I find the introduction to Nobody Knows My Name, published in 1961, as a particularly useful point to start in this regard. The essays in the book represent the period in which Baldwin struggled with the difficult questions of the self and the interior effects of racism. The context of reflection had changed. He was no longer in Europe and found himself in the South, confronting the sober truth about this country and about himself. He wrote, quote, in America, the color of my skin had stood between myself and me. In Europe, the barrier was down. Nothing is more desirable than to be released from an affliction, but nothing is more frightening than to be divested of a crutch. It turned out that the question of who I was not solved because I had removed myself from the social forces which menaced me. Anyway, these forces had become interior, and I had dragged them across the ocean with me. The question of who I was had at last become a personal question. And the answer was found in me, end quote. Now, this is 1961, and I want to suggest that here's a footnote. I have footnotes all throughout this talk, which suggest that I might read them or I might not. But there's this moment that this particular formulation is an echo from the notes of a native son. Right? That being divested of a crutch, right, echoes this a more personal formulation, right, where Baldwin recounts the last visit to see his stepfather, right? His reluctance to forgive him at this funeral, right? And Baldwin writes, the moment I saw him, I knew, quote, that why I had put off this visit so long. I had told my mother that I did not want to see him because I hated him. But this was not true, Baldwin writes. It was only that I had hated him and I wanted to hold on to this hatred. I did not want to look on him as ruin. It was not a ruin I had hated. I imagined that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, that they will be forced to deal with pain, end quote. Divested of the crutch of hatred, one has to confront what remains, the wounding. And that confrontation is the beginning of maturity. Right? So Baldwin, in this moment, in Nobody Knows My Name, sets the stage for the kind of examination necessary for leaving oneself behind and reaching for another, higher self. He invokes the Socratic dictum just a few lines later that, quote, the unexamined life is not worth living, end quote. And that examined life involves an acceptance of what this world, with its belief that white people ought to be valued more than others, has made of him, has made of us. Or as he put it in Nobody Knows My Name, quote, the question of color takes up much space in these pages, but the question of color, especially in this country, operates to hide the graver questions of the self, end quote. But acceptance must not be understood here as resignation to this social valuation, this kind of social evaluation in American society, a demand to accept white people as they are currently valued as a precondition for one's admittance to American society. Baldwin rejects that out of hand. I think I put it this way and begin again. He's writing, from France, Baldwin had to look toward America because no matter his desire to leave the life that consumed his stepfather, he remained decidedly of this place. Any honest confrontation with his own experience demanded a reckoning of sorts with the quarrel he had with the country that made him. France gave him the critical distance to do so apart from the daily thousand cuts of American racism. Baldwin said about his time in France, quote, I got over the terms in which Americans identified me. And I realized I'd never be controlled by them again. I didn't have to worry about acting like the N-word. I didn't have to prove anything to anybody, end quote. Baldwin rejects this idea that one had to accept America, right? America's understanding, its valuation of him. But he wrote in Discovery of What It Means to Be an American, right? Quote, I have never listened to Bessie Smith in America in the same way that for years I would not touch watermelon. But in Europe, Bessie Smith helped reconcile me to being an N-word. Fascinating. I do not think I could have made this reconciliation here. Once I was able to accept my role as distinguished, I must say, from my place in the extraordinary drama, which is America, I was released from the illusion that I hated America. And again, this is an extension of a point he makes in his essay, Notes of a Native Son. Quote, one would have to hold in the mind forever two ideas which seem in opposition. The first idea was acceptance, the acceptance totally without rancor of life as it is and men as they are. In the light of this idea, it goes without saying that injustice is a commonplace. But this does not mean that one could be complacent. But the second idea was of equal power, that one must never in one's own life accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight them with all one's strength. And this fight begins, however, in the heart. And it now had been laid to my charge to keep my own heart free of hatred and despair, end quote. And some years later, this becomes the basis of his advice to his nephew, and my dungeon shook. There, Baldwin insisted that his nephew understand the country for what it is and engage in self-trust in light of his own experiences of a country committed at once to white supremacy and to democracy. Quote, to take no one's word for anything, including mine, but trust your experience, Baldwin said to his nephew. Know whence you came. If you know whence you came, there's really no limit to where you can go, he said. Acceptance involves a clear-eyed view of what has brought you to now and what is required to leave it all behind. As Baldwin wrote, we take our shape, it is true, within and against the cage of reality bequeathed us at our birth. And yet it is precisely through our dependence on this reality that we are most endlessly betrayed. Society is held together by our need. We bind it together with legend, myth, coercion, fearing that without it, we will be hurled into that void within which, like the earth before the word was spoken, the foundations of society are hidden. From this void ourselves, Baldwin writes, it is the function of society to protect us. But it is only this void, our unknown selves, demanding forever a new act of creation which can save us, Baldwin writes. It is only our unknown selves demanding forever a new act of creation which can save us. Baldwin makes explicit over and over again the primal scene of instruction. It is a context in which Black people are seen as disposable. This scene, in all of its messiness, casts in relief Emersonian perfectionism. For Emerson, we have the task before us to ascend to higher forms of excellence. But this task isn't rooted in some fixed destination or some final resting place of perfection. The spiral stairs going upward, taking each step and leaving others behind. In a way, if there is a resting place, it differs for each person. Life's journey consists of better and more excellent versions of who we take ourselves to be. Each experience of significance calls us to our higher sense of ourselves and requires the abandonment of older versions. My good friend Jeffrey Stout puts it best, quote, the higher self congeals out of the highest intimations of excellence you can intuit from where you stand. Excellence and sacred value are the kinds of goodness that matters most for living well, end quote. But the daunting challenge of seeking a higher self in a world that denies one's standing gives new meaning to Du Bois's cry of two unreconciled strivers. For African Americans, as Langston Hughes said, life ain't been no crystal stair. To embrace perfectionism across the proverbial tracks then, and remember we are all on the other side of those tracks now, requires a confrontation with the reality of America as it is and what it has wrought in us. Quote, the time has come, God knows, Baldwin writes, the time has come, God knows, for us to examine ourselves, but we can only do this if we are willing to free ourselves of the myth of America and try to find out what is really happening here, end quote. We must tap the source, quote, of this long history of moral evasion that has had an unhealthy effect on the total life of the country. That will involve an honest confrontation with the idea of white America, and to invoke Alain Locke, that old Negro that white America has invented. Baldwin writes, there's an illusion. I told you I was going to quote a lot of passages, right? Just moving back and forth, right? There's an illusion about America, a myth about America to which we are clinging, which has nothing to do with the lives which has nothing to do with the lives we lead. And I don't believe that anybody in this country who has really thought about it, or really almost anybody who has been brought up against it, and almost all of us have one way or another, this collision between one's image of oneself and what one actually is always very painful. And there are two things you can do about it. You can meet the collision head on and try and become what you really are, or you can retreat and try to remain what you were, which is a fantasy in which you will certainly perish. Right? This insight applies to Black and white alike. But for now, I will keep my attention on Black folk. I mentioned at the start of this talk the importance of self-criticism or self-loathing to Taylor's reading of Moral Perfectionism in Dr. King. As Stanley Cavell notes, Emersonian perfectionism, quote, requires that we become ashamed in a particular way of ourselves, end quote. Whereas Taylor renders the insight, a commitment to ongoing self-transformation, quote, requires courage, and it flirts with and to some degree benefits from self-loathing. A perpetual disdain for the current state of things can inspire the endless striving that perfectionism counsels, though it may also undermine the project of attending to the state of one's soul, Taylor writes. Now, in Baldwin's hands and in Taylor's as well, I suspect this self-loathing is a direct consequence of a soul-crushing world organized in such a way that values white people more than others, the consequence of which shapes the very idea of the self of those who are not white. For example, in his essay, The Uses of the Blues, Baldwin clearly states what he takes to be the quote-unquote Negro problem. Listen, I'm talking about what happens to you if, having barely escaped suicide, or death, or madness, or yourself, you watch your children growing up, and no matter what you do, you are powerless. You are really powerless against the force, excuse me, against the force of the world that is out to tell your child that he has no right to be alive. And no amount of liberal jargon and no amount of talk about how well and how far we have progressed does anything to soften or to point out any solution to this dilemma. In every generation, ever since Negroes have been here, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world, some way to make the child who will be despised not despise himself. I don't know what the Negro problem means to white people, but this is what it means to Negroes, end quote. This is 1964. But Baldwin makes a similar point in 1955, as he, in his own mind, eulogizes his stepfather, quote, it was the Lord who knew of the impossibility every parent in that room faced, how to prepare the child for the day when the child would be despised, and to create in that child by what means a stronger antidote of this poison than one found in oneself. Here, the fact of growing up, of coming of age in a place that denies you standing distorts one's sense of self and disfigures one's character. It arrests one's capacities. And in that light, it's with great effort and risk that one takes up the task of self-creation in such a world. Baldwin put this point similarly in an essay entitled A Talk to Teachers, initially published as The Negro Child, His Self-Image. Baldwin writes, "It becomes thoroughly clear, at least to me, that any Negro who is born in this country and undergoes the American educational system runs the risk of becoming schizophrenic. On the one hand, he's born in the shadow of the stars and stripes, and he's assured it represents a nation which has never lost a war. He's part of a country in which anyone can become president and so forth. But on the other hand, he's also assured by this country and his countrymen that he has never contributed anything to civilization. That his past is nothing more than a record of humiliations gladly endured. It is, quote, it is against this reality and the full light of forces aimed at reproducing hierarchies for exploitation that the Black and brown child must forge herself. She must find the means to say no to a society that at every turn seeks to condemn her to a certain station of life. And for Baldwin, through his own autobiographical example, to refuse this sentence amounts to an extraordinary act of the will. One decides, and he doesn't give us much by way of how this happens, but one has to decide to say no to it all, to refuse the categorization, and at that point to enter into battle against one's society, as Baldwin put it. So where we are not is that a whole country of people believe I am the N-word, and I don't. And the battle is on, Baldwin writes. And the battle is on. This is what he tries to convey to William Buckley and the young students at Cambridge in 1965. Here, Baldwin insists on a sense of perspective, how the question of who we are gets handled, managed, and pursued under adverse condition matters. It matters if one bears the brunt of the police baton and if one does not. If one is a descendant of slaves or of slave holders, both may be inheritors of Ralph Waldo Emerson's call upon us, but the difference in circumstance matters greatly. As Baldwin writes in Black Power, quote, to persuade Black boys and girls, as we have for so many generations, that their lives are worth less than others and that they can live only on terms dictated to them by other people, by people who despise them, is worse than a crime. It is the sin against the Holy Ghost, end quote. This is, and it must be said without concern for hurt feelings or guilt, undeniably white supremacy. You know this in the field of philosophy. I don't need to go through that. Emerson is now across the railroad tracks. And for those of us who know this place, who know this feeling as intimately as we know our nightmares and dreams, if we are to strive for what perfectionism counsels, we must, as Baldwin put it, decide and state that we will control our own destiny and reject the identity given to us by others. And when we do this, Baldwin claims, we are talking revolution. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. Baldwin asserts a form of perfectionism in such an environment, and that assertion requires for Black and white alike an unflinching encounter with the ugliness of who we are, and a rejection of comforting illusions that hide the lie and all of the rot hidden underneath the American idea. Here, our moral and ethical senses are profoundly distorted, and any robust idea of the public good is obscured. As Baldwin provocatively writes, quote, what is most terrible is that American white men are not prepared to believe my version of the story, to believe that it happened, in order to avoid believing that they have set up in themselves a fantastic system of evasions, denials, and justifications, which system is about to destroy their grasp of reality, which is another way of saying their moral sense, end quote. This adds another layer of complexity to the context of the Black democratic perfectionism he commends. It is not just the fact that life as it is in this country says over and over again to the Black child of 15 or to the Black woman of 40 that you are less than, and it says this in every possible way. It is also the maddening fact that the country denies what it has done and continues to do to Black people, a kind of willful ignorance. As if what happened to George Floyd or Adrian Hill or Walter Wallace or Casey Goodson or Ayanna Jones or Sandra Bland or Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown is somehow a surprise. That innocence is the crime, Baldwin says. And it corroborates what he mercilessly describes as the monstrous quality of this place. Quote, there is something monstrous about never having been hurt, never having been made to bleed, never having lost anything, never having gained anything, because life is beautiful. In order to keep it beautiful, you're going to stay just the way you are. And you're not going to test your theory against all of the possibilities outside. America is like that, Baldwin writes. America is like that. The failure on our part to accept the reality of pain, of anguish, of ambiguity, of death has turned us into a very peculiar and sometimes monstrous people. End quote. The reality of white supremacy and its repeated evasions or outright denials makes the idea of white America abandoning older versions of themselves damn near impossible to conceive. Those committed to the idea seem to be comfortable right where they are. As Baldwin wrote in Nothing Personal with Richard Avingdon, this is 1964, quote, we are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies. Not only, for example, about race, whatever by this time in this country or indeed in the world this word may mean, but about our very natures. The lie has penetrated our most private moments in the most secret chambers of our hearts, end quote. This lack of self-trust, Baldwin suggested, blocks the way to a higher self. He used the language in The Fire Next Time when describing white America in the generality of, quote, an inability to renew themselves at the fountain of their own lives. I love that formulation, right? An inability to renew themselves at the fountain of their own lives because the person who distrusts himself has no touchstone for reality, for this touchstone can be only oneself, Baldwin writes. But to stay right where we are means to surrender to death. Means to surrender to death. So Baldwin's insistence on reaching for higher forms of excellence under captive conditions, and to be sure, white folk are trapped too, demands an unflinching encounter with the uses and abuses of the past. As he says in The White Man's Guilt, quote, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of references, our identities, and our aspirations, our frames of reference. And it's with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this, in great pain and terror that one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and forms one point of view. In great pain and terror, therefore, because therefore thereafter one enters into battle with that historical creation, oneself, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more humane and more liberating. I think there's much more to say here about the role of the past and what Baldwin commends. In his hand, history reveals itself not as determination, but as a kind of inheritance, not as continuity, but as connection and relation, where one event echoes or carries the imprint of another and calls it all into view. Historic facts and personages don't simply appear twice to signify on Marx's 18th Brumaire, right? But in multiple forms in ways like a blurred image with layers and depth that interrupt, intercede, folds back, and calls forth. For Black people, such an approach to history requires a self in particular that isn't reducible to a tangle of sociological statistics, as Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray described it. Baldwin calls it statistical stereotypes, right? Where the flat statistics and stereotypes that trap Americans in the farce that is race relations. And here I'm not talking about the version of the story that trades in Willie Hortons, the Willie Hortons or the bigger Thomases or the welfare queens or the thugs of the world, quote unquote. Those Black people who are natively criminal or because of their woeful circumstances destined to be criminal. That says more about white folk than it actually do about Black folk. I want to be clear about that. I'm not talking about that. Instead, Black democratic perfectionism requires a self with a rich and complex interiority. What William James refers to in the varieties of religious experience as a two-storied self, an interior that has been, whether we want to admit it or not, oftentimes terribly wounded by the inescapability of what Toni Morrison described as the nastiness that will dirty you on the inside. A self all too often haunted by the ghosts of our dead who didn't die right. You know what I'm saying, Pops? The dead who didn't die right, because the way our world is. For those of you who haven't read Jessamine Ward's extraordinary novel, Seeing Unburied Sing, she has this moment where there's the tree of the dead. She says the branches are full. They're full with ghosts, 2 or 3, all the way up to the top, to the feathered leaves. There are women and men and boys and girls, some of them near to babies. They crouch, looking at me. Black and brown, and the closest near baby, smoke white. None of them reveal their deaths, but I see it in their eyes, their great black eyes. They perch like birds, but look as people. They speak with their eyes. He raped me and suffocated me until I died. I put my hands up and he shot me 8 times. She locked me in the shed and starved me to death while I listened to my babies playing with her in the yard. They came in my cell in the middle of the night and they hung me. They found I could read and they dragged me out to the barn and gouged my eyes before they beat me. Still, I was sick. And he said I was an abomination. And Jesus says, suffer little children. So let her go. And he put me underwater and I couldn't breathe. Eyes blink as the sun blazes and winks below the forest line so that the ghosts catch the color, reflects the red. The sun making scarlet plumage of the clothes they wear, rags and breeches, t-shirts and tignuns, fedoras and hoodies. The dead haunt. The world that dirties you on the inside. This is the condition to imagine a different self, to reach for a higher self. Condition of wound, of brokenness, in a world that consistently devalues you. Perhaps I can make this point about Black democratic perfectionism. The point about a different accent or about a different, about self-loathing or of a particular sort more clearly by way of example. I'm coming home, I promise. I've used this example in other places, so forgive me for the repetition, but I think it's important. The internationally acclaimed Ghanaian artist Anatsui, known for his amazing sculptures and metal sheets made of discarded bottle caps, created a series of clay pots called the Broken Pots series. Here, Anatsui revealed his predilection for the found object, the discarded object. Fragments or shards of broken pots given depth and form by the trace of his hands reveal something about the form of Black perfectionism that I'm reaching for with my reading of Baldwin, with my citation of practice of all of those paragraphs, right? Anatsui insists on the importance of clay, its permanence and transience, its fragility and resilience. As Oli Ogwibe noted about Anatsui's work, quote, the transfiguration of clay from the state of malleability to one of rigidity invokes natural processes of formation and maturation. Yet the susceptibility of the rigid form to reductive transformation also denotes the absence of finality and the presence of infinite possibility, end quote. It led me to think about the references to John Jones and Du Bois's Of the Coming of John. Quote, for a long time, the clay seemed unfit for any kind of molding. Here, Du Bois registers how the context of America denies Black people the possibility of an existence otherwise. The clay is unfit. Permanence and rigidity are its primary features. But Anatsui helps us see otherwise, yes? The clay pot should be seen as a metaphor for the fragility of existence and the delicate nature of life. The broken pot in his hands comes to represent not a permanent state of brokenness, its transformation from one state to another, from that relegated to the trash bin to that which is beautiful, reflects what Ogwibe sees as a will to overcome, or what I'm suggesting as perfectionism. Leak as we may, we nevertheless continue to bend, Ogwibe says. He explains a broken pot, quote, may never regain its wholeness in terms of its original form, but at the point of its fracture appears a new objectivity, a new entity. And since no form is absolute, nor any condition final. No state is primary. Fate loses its sting again. Life ain't been no crystal stair, but we keep climbing. What we find in Anatsui's work is the indelible trace of that which survives in spite of. And that trace, marking brokenness and wound as the ground upon which we stand, provides a foundation for the continuous work for higher excellences, for better selves. This is what I'm referring to as Baldwin's Black democratic perfectionism. Baldwin commends perfectionism in the context of a system of domination that denies Black selves standing. He also insists on a vibrant and complex Black interiority in a world that reduces us to flat, predictable characters and narrates its history in a way to corroborate such descriptions. Both are bound up, constrained by an idea of history that substantiates the lie that some people matter more than others. But remember, Black democratic perfectionism is not some bourgeois preoccupation, some private affair with no public consequence. It has radical implications for the order of things, at least that's what I believe. To paraphrase Baldwin, the moment we step outside of the orbit of this world's expectations, we're talking revolution. That old Negro has been this world's North Star for too long. To put it in the ground, finally threatens to upend the whole damn thing. Obviously, Baldwin's witness entailed aspirational claims about what kind of society we hope to live in and what kinds of persons we aspire to be, as well as claims rooted in care about the historical depth of where we now stand, about the enduring legacy of white supremacy that deforms self-realization, and about the history of struggle that constitutes the backdrop of our current efforts. What he commends to us is situated in the histories of Black life in particular, and American life more generally. Stories that narrate the litany of events and the chorus of Black voices struggling for freedom and resisting the arbitrary use of power. These histories, at least as I read them, carry with them an ethical ought that the struggle and sacrifices of so many require of those who are its immediate beneficiaries, inheritors, a commitment to treating one's fellows justly and to ensuring a society where all can flourish. That is, a society in which all of us can reach for forms of excellence. Baldwin's democratic perfectionism. Oh, this talk is going on too long. I'm sorry, y'all. Baldwin's democratic perfectionism insists that we look the facts of our experience squarely in the face and challenge directly the idea that white people matter more and to upend a world comfortable with the senseless death of Black people. Acceptance, but leave it behind. In doing so, the Black democratic perfectionist makes herself, quote, a representative of a very particular way of life, shorn of the value gap. She offers a different way of living, an alternative to our current selves. And here, and I hope you hear Stanley Cavell, who states that others stand for selves we have not yet recognized or achieved. They represent our beyond. In this sense, as Emerson noted, the self-reliant individual in her unique genius can awaken the sleepers. How might this relate to Baldwin? That moment when he tells his nephew in The Fire Next Time that the terrible thing, oh buddy, is that you must accept them. You must accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. Our reaching for a higher self offers the gift of release for them into a different possibility. Or that moment in Down at the Cross when Baldwin describes the all too familiar terror and panic that has seized white America, as well as the private fears and longing projected onto Black people. He suggests that the only way white people can be released, quote, from the Negro's tyrannical power over him is to consent, in effect, to become Black himself. To become a part of that suffering and dancing country that he now watches wistfully from the heights of his lonely power, and armed with spiritual traveler's checks, visits surreptitiously after dark, and quote, a self-realization made possible by the experience of some form of excellence of those who are always, at least at once, despised and envied. Or in that moment in No Name in the Street, as he offers an account of Black power and its embrace of a liberating Blackness, where we see his perfectionism, this idea of a beyond based in a refusal that ushers in something more, quote, and I'm going to quote this passage and I'm coming to a close, I promise. To be liberated from the stigma of Blackness by embracing it is to cease forever one's interior agreement and collaboration with the authors of one's degradation. When the Black man's mind is no longer controlled by the white man's fantasies, a new balance, or what may be described as an unprecedented inequality, begins to make itself felt. The white man no longer knows who he is, or the Black man knows them both. For it is difficult to be released from the stigma of Blackness. It is clearly at least equally difficult to surmount the delusion of whiteness, Baldwin writes. And as the Black glories in this newfound color, which is his at last, and asserts not always with the very greatest politeness, the unanswerable validity and power of his being, even in the shadow of death, the white is very often affronted and very often made afraid. And then here's the line. One may indeed be wary, but the point is that it was inevitable that Black and white should arrive at this dizzying height of attention, this dizzying height of tension. Only when we have passed this moment will we know what our history has made of us, Baldwin said. Each of these examples shows the political significance of Baldwin's Black democratic perfectionism. It may very well be a revolutionary politics after all, in which we ironically offer a better way of life, a better way to live for those who are trapped in the illusion, the delusion of whiteness, by refusing to concede to what this world says about us, and instead reaching for a different way of living. The Black democratic perfectionist tradition models how to make life swing, Duke Ellington style. I'm done.
Should we start to dive into some questions?
Sure, if I can answer them. You know, I'm sleepy, so let's go.
And just you can, if I'll read them aloud, but Professor Glaude, you should be able to read them as well if you click on that Q&A, if it helps to have them in front of you.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a bunch, and I'll just start with them in order. So. You came to a philosophy department, so someone's going to ask you about Thomas Nagel to start off. Well, it sounds like this is someone's asking you to, or well, the passage I can read aloud, and then you're being asked to sort of comment on the sentiment of the passage. So, in Thomas Nagel's Mortal Questions, he says, quote, "When racial and sexual injustice have been reduced, we shall still be left with the great injustice of the smart and the dumb, who are so differently rewarded for comparable effort. This would be an injustice even if the system of differential economic and social rewards had no systemic sexual or racial reflection. And if the social esteem and economic advantages attaching to different occupations and educational achievements were much more uniform, there would be little cause for concern about racial, ethnic, or sexual patterns in education or work. At present, we have no way of divorcing professional status from social esteem and economic reward." End quote. What does Nagel get right here? What does he get wrong?
Yes, I'm in a philosophy department. What's fascinating about this is the to my mind, the absence of a thick historical account of what has produced the sorts of divisions in our society that result in the maldistribution of advantage and disadvantage, right? And it seems to me that only someone who's not paying attention to the specificity of that history would make the move that he makes and thinks that it could be resolved, right, simply by the measures that he delineates in that moment. You know, I mean, there's a way in which, you know, I think Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun is right. Faulkner's point about the past, Baldwin's point about the past, right? The way in which this society has been constituted, right, is such that race and sexual difference, right, has had such an impact on the distribution of goods that this doesn't make any sense to me as a remedy. So I want to insist, so what he gets wrong here is an inattentiveness to how history has set us on a particular path. And I was trying to make that point over the course of the talk.
Okay, thank you. The next comes from Phil Oliver. This is about Dewey. What do you think Dewey would say about the state of things in America today with respect to race, education, democracy, and a common faith? And what would Baldwin say to Dewey?
You know, I often find myself, Brother Oliver, kind of hesitant to try to anticipate the words of folk, we could just read them. So, I think we could more than likely assume that Dewey is going to commend to us something about critical intelligence, I suppose, and the like. And he has that common faith is in part something that I've been riffing on in my own work, right? In Uncommon Faith, it is my engagement with that little book of Dewey's that has been so impactful on me. And part of what I'm trying to do is to deal with the reality of brokenness and woundedness for the kind of religious attitude that I'm commending, or the Black religious attitude that I'm describing. So in a way, I'm supplementing my own reading of Dewey by bringing him across the tracks. That's what I tried to do with In a Shade of Blue. That's what I tried to do with In a Common Faith. So I suspect Dewey would want to, I don't want to engage in trying to anticipate what he thinks and what would Baldwin say to Dewey. I can only imagine what Jimmy would say to Dewey. Right, probably would ask him to loosen up a little bit, bro. Let's have a Johnny Walker Black together. I'm finding it fascinating that this is where people locate, where they're locating the questions, But anyway, this is fascinating.
There are a lot of proper names. People are asking about a lot of proper names. Well, but here's another one. We went from Dewey, now we'll go to pragmatism in general.
No.
I listen. It's funny, as I listened to an interview with you earlier today as I was doing dishes, and you tried to define pragmatism, which is what this question is about. Right. But I mean, so I'm going to pose the question and then you can refuse. But can you define pragmatism and its role in contemporary social political thought? And when I was listening to this interview with you, earlier, maybe just to give it just a little bit more of like a context, the person who was calling in was criticizing pragmatism for being a kind of mere, the mere idea that the ends justify the means. Like that's what pragmatism is as an approach to like social political problems. And at least there, I thought you answered the question well. So I'm gonna re-raise it here. Yeah.
So Professor, let me say why I'm reluctant to answer the question. And this is why I stand at a certain relation to the field of philosophy, right? That I stand at a certain angle to it. So what have I tried to do over the course of this talk? I tried to give a reading of James Baldwin's democratic perfectionism. I tried to do so in such a way that says that what does it mean to pay attention to the particular conditions under which a self is constituted, under captivity and in a constant state of precarity? What does it mean to imagine reaching for a higher self under those circumstances, as well as a set of conditions in which one is really evading telling the truth about that self, right? Acceptance, right? Baldwin. So I'm trying to grapple with, right, what does it mean to be in a place that lies to itself about its history, organizes the distribution of advantage and disadvantage in such a way that certain people are generally disregarded? What does it mean to imagine reaching for a higher self under those conditions? And what's fascinating is that the question becomes about pragmatism, about an abstract philosophical position. And part of what I'm my response is to say that evasion speaks volumes that I don't want to tend to. The evasion speaks volumes. Why can't we, let's put it another way. If you can't access the talk because you don't know the archive, instead of trying to transfer the center of gravity of the talk onto a terrain that you know, how about asking a question so that you can learn the terrain better that you don't know? You see the move I'm making here? I suppose that those of you who are in Africana philosophy, you've been trying to do this for a while, but it's always the case. You make the argument, you're talking about race, and suddenly somebody wants to ask about Hegel. right? You're talking about this, somebody wants to start, wants to go back to the camp. That's why, and I'm a pragmatist. I've written on this. I can answer the question. I just think in light of what I've tried to do, I guess I should, but I think we should try to do something else. Does that make sense?
Fair enough. Fair enough. This next one comes from Rob Talise. I'd like to hear a little more about the democratic nature of the perfectionism you've described. I understand its political dimension, and it's certainly egalitarian, but what makes it also democratic?
I think that's a wonderful question, Bob. So look, I gestured at this in the very beginning of the talk. In my Du Bois lectures at Harvard, I try to offer a reading of Miss Ella Baker, right? And I think Miss Baker, who, for those of you who don't know, she's one of the most important political organizers and democratic theorists, in my view, of the 20th century. You can't imagine, for example, she helped organize the local chapters of the NAACP in the South in the early part of the 20th century. She was the first executive secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Before that, she helped raise funds for the Montgomery Improvement Association with the Montgomery bus boycott. But for me, one of her most important moments was opening up space for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? Organizing the conference that led to its organization in April of 1960 at Shaw University. And what she insisted upon, even in providing space for these students, was an idea of leadership that presumed that everyday ordinary people had the capacity to be the leaders that they were looking for. And that the way in which SNCC organized was not to kind of impose a version of leadership, right, onto a particular community, to helicopter in, but to create the conditions under which local indigenous leadership could emerge. People like Fannie Lou Hamer and the like, who would then, right, engage in the work. So part of what she argued, at least part of what I claim she argued, right, is that we create the conditions under which these people can see themselves otherwise, that they can imagine themselves differently. And in doing so, expand the conception of the polity, expand the idea of who matters within the democratic polity. So part of what I'm assuming, Bob, is the background of that reading of Miss Baker and my engagement with Sheldon Rowland, which is a lecture I gave at the Divinity School here at Vanderbilt a couple of months back, right? That she is actually putting forward a perfectionist model that expands our conception of who matters in the demos, right? Which is pretty essential to my conception of democratic politics, if that makes sense. I don't know if that was clear, but again, it's late. I'm an early riser, so.
Our next question comes from Leonard Richards, Jr. How do those of us who wish to achieve the Black democratic perfectionist ideal combat against those who refuse to? And the examples given are white supremacists, Black conservative apologists, etc.
We continue to reach for a higher self, accepting who we are and continuing to reach for a higher self. But actually, that doesn't mean that politics actually ends with that in mind, right? So we continue to fight for the goods that we think are best for a democratic society. So if I hold the view, and I hope you hold it with me, that a society organized along the lines that some people ought to be valued more than others because of the color of their skin, and then that society distributes advantage and disadvantage accordingly, right? And functions in such a way, to echo Paul Taylor's language, in the way that people who aren't white are generally disregarded, right? Then we have to fight, right, to fundamentally upend that. And how do we do that? Well, we do it together, and we put forward some concrete political aims and ambitions, and we work for it. And I honestly believe in fighting for a more just set of arrangements, we are doing the work. It can be the conditions under which we can leave our abandoned old selves that we can become even more ashamed of as we become clear about certain sets of arrangements that have produced differential outcomes for some of us and others, you see. So we continue to fight for a more just world in light of these contradictions, if that makes sense.
Thank you. This next question comes from Karen Ing. You started with two wonderful epigraphs from Baldwin and Cavell. Could you say more about what you take the philosophical connection between them, take to be the philosophical connection between them, and how they help illuminate each other's thought?
Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful question. In some ways, the quotation from A Stranger in the Village was my attempt to show how Baldwin recasts the problem that Emerson is exploring in The American Scholar and the Harvard Divinity School Address. Right? There's a way in which Emerson is trying to get these insecure Americans to think about themselves on their own terms, right? To imagine America differently, right? To imagine themselves differently. Baldwin recasts that problematic in light of, right? Now you're not just simply looking to Europe, you're looking to Europe for a reason in relation to me, right? And so he says, it has created a new, not like he says, the time has come to realize that the interracial drama acted out on the American continent has not only created a new Black man, it has created a new white man too. No road whatever will lead Americans back to the simplicity of this European village, right? So this kind of gaze back towards Europe, right? Actually blinds one to what is actually happening here, but to really turn one's attention to what has happened here, right? Involves this confrontation with the reality of race and what it has produced that is distinct and unique. So the American problematic gets recast here. Now, why is this important? Because it's under those conditions that Black folk reach for higher selves, right? What are the consequences of this unique American situation, right? Well, part of it is what I've described. And then the quote from Cavell is that the democratic need for perfection is a path from the idea of there being one who represents for each of us the height of the journey. Socrates, no. To the idea of each of us being representative for each of us. Right? And that goes back to this extraordinary formulation, right? That, and the genius of other selves can awaken us from our slumber, right? Where our efforts, our perfectionist desires, right, can serve as a model for you. So what does it mean? How are these Black folks still smiling? What does it mean that this sound comes from? What does it mean that they are reaching for this different way of being in the world? How might that serve as a model for me? And here I'm taking on the voice of our white fellows in this regard. But that can be a threat too, right? Not just simply an opportunity, a threat to the very ways in which the world has been organized. That's what I was thinking about in those two quotations, right? In some ways, the epigraphs represent the argument of the piece.
Well, the next question comes from Eric Ritter, who's probably our leading departmental Cavellian, so maybe there'll be some continuity here. Thinking specifically in the wake of Begin Again, I was wondering if you see any significant differences in the shape of Baldwin's Black democratic perfectionism before and after the murders of civil rights leaders in his work pre and post civil rights movement. I understand there are fundamental continuities, but if indeed you think there are also important differences, what are those differences?
Yeah, this is I struggle with this in writing this piece. And in the end, I try to, and Eric, thank you so much for that question, Professor Ritter. I try to address it with the litany of quotations from Notes of a Native Son, The Fire Next Time, and then the long passage from Nobody Knows My Name, where even when Baldwin's we shifts, as I think Professor Ritter is alluding to, right? There's a sense in which the early Baldwin, our beyond, the beyond that Black folk represent, that can awaken white folk from their slumber, right, is in the foreground. But after the assassination of King, the accent changes in Baldwin's writing, right? He's not so much preoccupied with, you must accept them, old boy, as he said to his nephew, right? Because, he's trying to grapple with what does it say about these folk that they would kill someone like King, an apostle of love. But I don't want to suggest that the aim of Baldwin's project fundamentally shifts. He's a bit more impatient. The anger is much more in the foreground. But as he said when he resigned from the Liberator in 65, 67, I can't remember the date off the top of my head. I should. He says, I want us to do something unprecedented. And that is to create a self without the need for enemies. And he's resigning from the Liberator, which was a Black nationalist publication, because it is anti-Semitic. And he's saying we can't become like them. We can't become, if we fall into the trap, we become monstrous, right? So I want us to do something unprecedented, to create a self without the need for enemies, even as he shifts. So I think that the shift is in the axis. He's much more concerned with creating the conditions under which Black folk reach for a higher self. And he's doing that within the context of Black aesthetics as he understands it, of trying to find a form that isn't preoccupied with the gaze, trying to grapple with a generation of folk who have grown up without the depth of self-hatred that he himself experienced as a young child. He's trying to find, right, a different space from which to call for the construction of a different self, it seems to me. But the aim seems to be consistent. I hope that makes sense, Professor. Thank you for your question.
That's great. I mean, we now have a series of questions that sort of digging deeper into some lines from Baldwin. So this comes from Adam Rosencarroll. So can you say a bit more about and help us imagine both more concretely and more capaciously what it means to, quote, resist at whatever cost the fearful pressures placed on one to lie about one's experience, end quote.
Yeah, that's a powerful line. To resist at whatever cost the fearful pressures placed on one to lie about one's experiences. Right? You can read that in a number of different directions, right? To lie about one's desires, right? To know that one has experienced the world in such a way where what it means to love another who may be of the same sex as you. What does it mean to because of the demands of the world that you're going to closet yourself, right? Or what does it mean when that moment when Baldwin is talking to those young Howard students in 1963, don't believe what the world says about you, because the story, the purpose of the story, I think the repeated narration of his stepfather's death is not only because Baldwin is trying to possess that for himself, because it's central to his own kind of growth, right? But it's also this lesson learned. What does it mean to concede to the world what it says about you? What does it mean? Remember that quick passage from the Uses of the Blues, that whatever the Negro problem is, that every parent has to figure out a way, right, to keep that child from believing what the world says about that child. So what does it mean to concede that what the world says about you is true, right? It means you've lost. Self-hatred will consume, self-trust is forever gone. So what does it mean to resist at whatever cost the fearful pressures placed on one to lie about one's experience? I think it is if you concede to the lie, to the lie about one's experience, you basically give up on the quest for a higher self. You're permanently docked at the station. That's the cost, right? And so we must at all costs, whatever the cost, risk stepping outside of that. And Baldwin did it in such a way that sometimes it felt uncomfortable. Sometimes it almost felt narcissistic, right? But that's a different kind of conversation to have. I know I'm not being clear, but again, I'll try to be clear, I promise.
No, it's great. I mean, this next question is something you kind of already started to talk about. So I'll read it, and if there is more you want to elaborate on, go ahead. But it brings up the quote that you just mentioned. Thank you, Professor Glaude, for your lecture and witness. Talk to us about Baldwin's talk to the Howard students. Don't believe what the world says about you, and dig deeper into the centering of Blackness in the American political scene and in life in general. How can we love ourselves and live in such a way where we are not focused on the white gaze, in Toni Morrison's words, or living within the veil in the Du Boisian sense?
Wow, yeah. I mean, it's this wonderful moment, you know, because the students at Howard, they're members of NAG, right? The student organization that was so important for SNCC. You have the Washington, you know, the Washington D.C. contingent of SNCC, the Atlanta University contingent of SNCC, and that Fisk contingent of SNCC, Professor Outlaw, right? All those folk, right? And those students had began their political career working with Gloria Richardson, trying to desegregate businesses in Cambridge, Maryland, and then found themselves in the bowels of the South. This is 63, y'all. This is Bull Connor, 63. This is Birmingham, right? This is the March on Washington will happen a bit later, and then of course the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church and the murder of those 4 little girls. Baldwin saw in the eyes of these young folk a kind of weariness. They were tired. Michael Thelwell told me that they were mentally exhausted and angry because they had seen raw terror, right, in the South. And so Baldwin is chopping it up with them until the sun comes up. You know, I write about the fact that there's no liquor store, so they find a bootlegger and they get Jimmy some liquor, and they're drinking until the sun. And then that's when he says to them, you promise me that you won't believe what the world says about you, then I promise I will not betray you. Because to believe what the world says about you is to concede to the terms, right, that have been set for you. And it's to resign yourself to your place, not your role. Remember that distinction that I read in Baldwin, right? And that was in Stranger in the Village, an earlier essay. He said, I came to understand my role as distinguished from my place. So the moment we accept it, right, we resign ourselves to our place, and self-hatred threatens to consume. So as I tell my son, and I tell my students, and I tell myself over and over again, this world as it is currently organized conspires to make you small. And the question you must ask yourself is, will you be complicit? Right? Will you be complicit in it? So how can one love oneself? How does one live in such a way where we're not focused on the white gaze? Well, for Baldwin, if you read his essay, Nothing Personal, which is the essay that is part of Richard Avenden's photographic book, Baldwin locates, right, doing that work within a broader community of love in relationship to a set of stories, narratives that empowers one, if that makes sense. So what does it mean to love oneself? Well, inhabit a space in which you are loved, right? And what does it mean to kind of try to work in such a way where you're not so focused on the white gaze? In some ways, to understand yourself as part of a tradition that is the wind beneath your wings to reach for a higher self. Well, that's not an answer, but I'm trying to get to one. But anyway.
I'm gonna, for the time we have left, prioritize some folks who haven't asked a question yet. I'm seeing some repeats in our list, if that's all right. I'm gonna go to this question from Tim Hughes, question from a history major and practicing lawyer, not a philosopher. After the last year, are you more hopeful or cynical today on making effective progress on race, democracy, and most importantly, on addressing Baldwin's central concern about white lives being treated as having more inherent value in our society than Black? What are the most important and effective concrete steps we should be taking today to improve on these arcs?
I have a blue-soaked hope, as I've put it, right? You know, it's that moment in Du Bois's Of the Passing of the Firstborn, a hope not hopeless, but unhopeful. We're at a moment, a critical moment, an inflection point where the nation faces a choice. And any conjunctural moment, to use Stuart Hall's language, any conjunctural moment carries with it, you know, not only a moment of crisis, but a moment of possibility. That we actually have a chance to choose to be otherwise. And so it's precisely in confronting that choice that I at least have some hope. You know, Baldwin has this wonderful formulation that human beings are at once disasters and miracles. We have to protect ourselves from the disasters that we've become. But if human beings show up, yeah, if we show up, we at least have a chance for a miracle, right? If we show up. So I think I'm hopeful. I wouldn't say that I'm more hopeful, but I'm hopeful in this moment that we at least have a chance to choose to be otherwise. But you know, at every moment in which a new America is about to be born, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around the baby's neck. So I pray that we can be better midwives in this moment, you know, to echo Baldwin's language at the end of No Name in the Street. And what are some of the most important and effective concrete steps we should be taking today to improve on these arcs? You know, I think there's a crisis of imagination in some ways. We have to begin to imagine in a much more expansive way. And I want to say that concretely, right? We have been playing on the field of Ronald Reagan for the last 40 plus years. The assumptions of Reaganism have defined our conception of government, have defined our relationship to each other, whether those is, you could describe it as Reaganism or neoliberalism, however you want to describe it, right? It has changed our relationship to each other. And it's, in some ways, I think it has done done much harm to the body politic in some ways. So I think we need to imagine in much more expansive terms a different way of being together, and what that will look like, and what government's role will play, what government's role will be in that imagining. That's what I hope. Yeah, but that's a way of getting at it. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I see Phil has returned.
Phil has returned. I was going to prioritize those who have not.
Okay.
Unless you would like to have a little back and forth about Dewey, I could leave it up to you. But well, here's one. I wanted to go down to maybe Sidney Jones's question, just because this is the Berry Lecture in Public Philosophy, and it's kind of about this question about we're on the one hand, we're in an academic setting, but it's supposed to involve something much more than that. Sidney Jones asks, how do you suppose we spread the theory of Black democratic perfectionism outside of the academic setting?
You know, I actually think I'm just trying to label something that is happening, that happens daily. Right? I think there are these these extraordinary examples in everyday life of folk imagining themselves otherwise under captive conditions, doing exactly what I just described. Right? I've just called it something. I think there's a tradition of Black letters that can be identified as Black democratic perfectionism, right? And I think I can tell that story from, you know, Baldwin, and I mean, from Ralph Ellison to Baldwin to Morrison to Ayanna Math. I think I could tell that story. But I think attentiveness, attention to everyday life would give us a myriad of examples of folk who are doing exactly what I'm describing in the abstract. I know I've experienced it as a child growing up on the coast of Mississippi, right, where excellences, right, have been models for me, right, to imagine myself beyond the constraints of my little hometown. And you know, they were my beyond, which allowed me to reach for a different way of conceiving of myself. My mother dropped out of school in the 9th grade. My father was a Vietnam vet who, the only book in our house, let me say it differently, the only reading that happened in my household was the newspaper. So how the hell did I show up, right? And so part of that has something to do with, in my everyday experience, there were those around me in a community that was predominantly Black, modeling a way of being in the world that served as a call for me to reach for a different self. But it required right? In acceptance of who I am, who I was, as the ground to leave it behind. I couldn't lie about who I was. I had to tell the truth, such that I could actually reach for something else, not just simply create a fiction that would then be tied down by the ghost of my past selves, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's what I would say, Sydney. Yeah.
I think maybe please let me know if there are any that are particularly jumping out at you. If not,
I can barely keep up. Look at my eyes,
okay.
y'all.
we're almost at the finish line. We have lots of eager audience members. So quote the anonymous attendee here. So for white Americans to grapple with the truth of America, they must let go of the, quote, wages of whiteness, to use Du Bois's concept. What recommendations would you offer to white Americans to overcome that addiction?
Oh, it's a hard question, you know? I think asking the question is the beginning. What does it mean to try, you know, Heather McGhee has written an extraordinary book entitled The Sum of Us, trying to get us to tackle this zero-sum game that's at the heart of how we approach the issue of racial inequality in this country. I would urge everyone to read The Hidden Wound by Wendell Berry, this Kentucky-born guy who's struggling with the fact that racism comes to him as naturally as language, right? Or even that moment in Baldwin where Baldwin makes a distinction between white people and people who happen to be white. Right? Those who are invested in a world that's organized along the lines of the value gap, and those who recognize what the value gap is doing and trying desperately to deconstruct, make a choice and figure out how that choice will play itself out in the life that you choose to live. I think the best way to do it is in practice, right? To risk oneself in solidarity with others in pursuit of certain aims and goods, right? That you take to be consonant with a more just America. Right? Not to do it in abstraction, right? But to get a clear sense of what you take to be a just set of arrangements to be, and then to align yourself with those practices aimed at bringing about a more just world. And I think in that doing, sounding like a Dewey in here, in that doing, it seems to me, a different self will emerge, perhaps. And we have historical examples of this over and over again, of what happens in solidarity to our conceptions of ourselves as we're working for a more just world. But I think it's really important for us to kind of we have to deconstruct this philanthropic or charitable model that we have for racial justice or racial equality. Baldwin had this wonderful line. He used it at a congressional hearing with Betty Shabazz. He says, "I'm very skeptical of white liberals." He says, "I'm skeptical of people who want to do something for me as opposed to with me." So part of what Baldwin is trying to say in that moment is that when we think of racial equality as a philanthropic enterprise, as a charitable gesture, we're still caught within the frame. So those solidaristic efforts can't happen with the idea that I'm doing something for people, as opposed to with people, right? And I think it's in that doing that different kinds of selves can emerge. Yeah, I'm rambling, but you get the point.
That's great. I wanted to come down there. Here's one from someone who hasn't asked the question yet, from Brooke Ackerley, and it's kind of just a different sort of question. It's almost about like how one reads Baldwin, sort of the hermeneutics of that enterprise. And so she asks, what do you listen to and read for in Baldwin to hear whether the use of the word you and self are individual or political, or does he leave it to us to move from the singular self to the political?
No, I love this question. You know, Baldwin sometimes argues by analogy, right? So the very thing he's calling for at the personal level, he then applies to the nation at large, right? Because remember, he says that the Socratic life, he embraces the Socratic dictum that the unexamined life is not worth living, and he gives that a certain kind of twist because he wants to say that the messiness of our interior lives are actually reflected in the messiness of our external arrangements. The fact that we haven't dealt with our own wounds and traumas and pain has resulted in a world organized in such a way that reflects those wounds and those evasions of those wounds and traumas and pains. So on the one hand, he's arguing by analogy. So at one moment, you'll see him talking about his own, grappling with his own kind of wounds, right? Telling the story of his stepfather, trying to come to a sense of why the pain was a crutch, trying to figure out what does it mean to love, and And then next thing you know, he makes the transition to the nation at large, where the insight learned at the personal level becomes the wisdom needed for national transformation. So so one way to read him is to keep track of when he moves from the personal to the collective, and to understand the nature of the shift. Another thing to pay attention with Baldwin is that his pronouns are so promiscuous, you know? So there's a we that's his insider, where he's talking only to Black folk. You have to pay attention. There's a we when he's assuming the narrative voice of white America. And then there's an aspirational we. And so how to keep track of the ways in which, what narrating voice he's using in that moment and for what purposes is really fascinating. So, you know, and also, you know, I try to read Baldwin like I read Emerson. And the way I read Emerson, I've learned a lot from Cavell, Professor Ritter. But the way in which I read Emerson is I read each sentence as a universe unto itself. And so I sit down with that sentence and try to make my way to the next one. I think that's why Baldwin is so quotable, precisely because of that.
Yeah. Okay, we have a lot of questions left, but I think this is going to have to be our last for the sake of time. And so I'm going to choose one that's sort of impressive in its brevity. This is the one from Scott Aiken, but probably not going to be. It'll demand a not so brief answer, but we'll see how well we can do. Scott Aiken simply asks, what role does religion play in this story?
Well, I try to make the case in An Uncommon Faith, the Shriver Lectures. It's a small book. I do a reading of Phil Oliver. I do a reading of John Dewey's A Common Faith. I mean, the book is a play, obviously, on that book. And I put forward something that I'm calling the Black religious attitude, right? Where I offer a reading of Du Bois as a third way between what I take from Dewey and what I take from William James. There's something about William James's view of religion as a cry for help, that I think escapes Dewey's account of the religious in Uncommon Faith. And as a person who has had to grapple with loss, not only in terms of my family, but also out of the tradition which I come, this cry, right, this moan, this groan that James was so attentive to matters to me. And so it's in my reading of the passing of the firstborn, not of the faith of the fathers. At the end of the faith of the fathers, Scott, listen to me, Du Bois calls for a new religious ideal, and he's too deliberate. He's too deliberate in terms of the arrangement of the book. He calls for a new religious ideal at the end of the faith of the fathers. And the next essay is of the passing of the firstborn. So I argue that you have to read of the passing of the firstborn as an answer to what he calls for of the faith of the fathers. And it's precisely in the way in which I read the religious attitude, which is a feature of the perfectionist tradition that I'm trying to lay bare, that one can see how I think religion plays a role here. So I would urge you, and this is kind of a selfish conceit, if you want to see how I think about it, to turn to the last chapter of the third chapter of Uncommon Faith. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. So you're an early riser. It's 8:45 here in Central Time. It's been a wonderful discussion. Just thank you so much for the lecture.
I feel so inadequate, Professor Condon. I do.
You should not. You should not. But yeah, I want to say in closing, on behalf of the Vanderbilt Philosophy Department, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you for raising really thoughtful, great questions that led to a great discussion. Yeah, and of course, thank you, Professor Glaude, for a wonderful lecture and discussion.
I appreciate you.